Just like the first speaker, I'm a little less organized than I'd like to be because I decided at the last minute to talk about something different than my research. So I just wanted to say my name is Nikola and I love coal. I love coal so much, I do it as my job. And it's not very hard for me to admit that to you guys because that I'm a coal geologist and we're all geochemists here. But if I walked downstairs and just outside onto the street and started telling people I love coal, I might get a bit of a different reaction. And I don't think it's very hard to understand this and understand why, because even in North America, Australia, depending on where you live, coal has a very black reputation. So for most people, when they think about coal, they think about these sort of toxic black lumps that we either burn to make steel, or even worse, we crush them up and we put them in a power station to generate energy. So when we think about coal, often we just think about coal with its association with modern climate change, which isn't wrong, not at all. But this is the perception that most people have of coal. And that is the most true, I think, for where I'm from, which is Australia. So in Australia, we have a very deeply enriched mining culture, particularly coal mining, that contributes a lot to our economy. The only thing is last year the National Bureau of Science, CSIRO, in Australia did a study, and they found that most of the people in Australia thought that the mining industry was the least trustworthy industry in the entire country. So it was a little baffling for some people to know that, given how much Australians rely on the mining industry. So coming from there, something else is that in Australia, we actually burn coal for energy. 75% of the energy we use comes from burning coal in power stations. And yet, Australia has one of the largest and widespread grassroots movements and movements against the coal industry and the mining industry in the world. And again, rightfully so, there's no reason this shouldn't exist. But the problem is that that's also working against things like coal research, or working in areas where we're somehow with or adjacent to mining companies. So that leads people to believe that if we can't trust a mining company because of their practices, we can't trust researchers or scientists who are also working in this field. So that becomes a problem for us as scientists. So, and this isn't a problem exclusively for coal. I'm talking about coal because I'm a coal geologist. But if you're working in oil and gas, or if you're working in iron ore, you're working in base metals, anything like this, you might find that it's very, very difficult to communicate your research to the general public, because you have to work against this reputation that the mining industry has sort of set in front of you. So it becomes very, very difficult, because inadvertently the people we're trying to communicate to are the people who are often paying for the research, or in part paying for our research. So it's up to us to sort of try and communicate that to them. And so that's something we need to get over as geochemists. So I think for a lot of us, what we do is when we talk to people out in public, we often make provisos. So for instance, for me, I'll say, oh, I work in coal, but I work in coal as like a fossil to study ancient environments. I don't burn it or anything like that. Or I might say, yeah, I get all my samples from mines or from drill core, but I don't do anything to do with mining. And the problem is that when we add these provisos to our work, we're inadvertently, and not meaning to, not being totally honest with people. And that becomes a problem, because then we're just reinforcing this idea that the scientists adjacent to mining or working with mining companies can't be trusted. So we need to really get over this tendency we have to add provisos to our work. So the problem is that when we want to be honest and say everything about our research, our world becomes very, very small. So it's limited to things like the Heinz Convention Center, and even then, so of the 4,000 people here, maybe only 1,000 will understand your research, maybe only 500, of those people will understand where you're coming from when you're trying to communicate. So what we need to do is overcome that barrier, not only within our own field, but to the general public as well. And the answer is, like, how do we fix that? And I don't have an answer, but I think one of the main things we need to try and do is to start dialogue if you're working in industry or adjacent to industry, start creating dialogue between yourself and people like in this picture that we have up here. So this is from an anti-coal protest in Sydney, Australia, which had about 8,000 people. That happened only recently. So we need to be able to start dialogue with people who may or may not know what you do, that may or may not be within the industry itself. So, and that becomes very important, because when we are able to give our opinions to different people, they're able to respect and give you credit for something. So instead of having, like, reinforcing this negative opinion that people have of the mining industry, you want to create a positive opinion for people who are working in science. So whether that's from just once a year doing a talk at a local pub, or you have a Twitter, you're starting a blog, just doing something where you're able to give yourself a platform to give a meaningful message to a non-scientific community. And I think that's really important for us as individuals as well, because it allows us to get out of this bubble, basically, that we trap ourselves in, where we're in these echo chambers, where we're only talking to other scientists. So for me, it becomes incredibly important, because I think we need to be able to convince the general public and the voters why we do is important, why it's important, so they can vote and they can convince the government why they think that's important. And ultimately, they're the people who give us our jobs. And without them, we're just scientists who have this bad reputation, as dark as the rocks that we work on. Thank you.